There are multiple ways to generate code documentation. So the first one is when you create a pull request. So in my case, I created this particular pull request, and when I merge this code, Penify will know that the code has been merged, and it will try to generate the document. It will try to generate the documentation or update the documentation on this function. So you will see Penify dev is running, and then it will see now committed the documentation of creating the pull request. Documentation generation completed. Now you will see that the pull request has been created. Pull request for the documentation. Now the following, it has created a new set of documentation, new and better documentation. Request documentation box. So this is the proposed changes for which I want to create a pull request. I click on create pull request. This is the function, these are the details, and then I click on create pull request. Now our pull request contains some basic info. Now what Penify will do is it will generate pull request documentation of this pull request. So you see, it has created descriptions, it has added descriptions, it has modified the title based on your parameters, like it will write a better title. Then it added PR review, in which it gave an estimate on like what this PR is about and how much time it will take. Okay. Additionally, it added PR code suggestions as well. So it added like what could be the possible bug, possible issue, maintainability, and it added practice sets, practice as well. Okay, so then this is the way in which pull request documentation works. We can also check like what are all additional things Penify provide. Reacted with an emoji, and then it produced the things that Penify do. Okay, so again, we have already seen pull request description, pull request review. We can ask questions about this pull request, and then we can also add documentation in this documentation of this pull request, like the function code docstring level documentation. So let's see how this works. So currently our function doesn't have any documentation added in here. Okay, so let's click on add docs. We'll see, okay, a new changes has been made, and Penify has added documentation in this particular PR. Let's see what was this change about. So in the existing PR, Penify added this entire documentation. Okay, so if you go down, if you see the entire def, you will see that the documentation has been added in the same PR. Previously we didn't have any documentation, but now we have this documentation as well. Now let's do some additional stuff, like let's ask question. Let's ask what is this PR about? Penify has reacted with eyes emoji. Now it will generate an answer to this particular. Okay, so it gave a detailed answer on what is this PR. This PR introduces and added all the relevant details. So after you install Penify, it will automatically appear over here in this dashboard or Penify dashboard. Okay, now go to your repository. Now here you will see three options: generate architecture documentation, API documentation, generate documentation for entire repository. So this option is selected when you have to click on entire documentation for your entire repository. When you have to generate architecture documentation, you click over here. Okay, now this architecture documentation will get started. Now you will see the process is running. Now after some time, this architecture documentation will get generated, and you can see your architecture documentation over here. I have a sample repository for which architecture documentation has already been created. Architecture documentation usually takes a lot of time to create, so let me show you an example for which we have already created the documentation. Zenorad, and this is the repository for which we have created an architecture documentation, and here is the Here is the documentation page, and you will see in here as the entire repository, and it's has been documented over here. You can go to either the classes. Let's see, go over classes. Let's see chat. Go and let's go to the chat form, and you will see the documentation. Detailed low level design doc has been created over here, and you will get the function, what page of the function does, or the details of the function over here. API documentation. So what exactly is an API documentation? API documentation is a collection of endpoints that helps in collection of resources for that helps developer use an API. So for example, if you'll see, this is a Stripe API documentation for this particular endpoint v1/charges, and these are the details. So usually the entire API documentation is created manually by some developers or some documentation writers. In Penify, what we have tried to do is we have tried to automate the API documentation. For now, what you can do is when you click on this button, it will create your API documentation. Like usually what happens is when you integrate yeah, your frameworks would release a bunch of endpoints which will have a very syntactical documentation. So something like Netlify, if you see here, the documentation is very syntactical. Now if you have integrated Penify to your repository, Penify will use your syntactical documentation and create a beautiful detailed API documentation. For example, we will see over here, these are the details that Penify added for this particular endpoint. Okay, so status report documentation. So these are the details Penify used LLMs and your code to build this particular API documentation. So what you just need to do, you need to click on here, and then at the end of the day, it will generate the API documentation. You will see over here. What will happen is after that, it will host your API documentation on your particular on an endpoint, and then what it will also do is it will also create a pull request with your it can also create your a pull request with your updated API documentation details, so that if you want, you can host your own documentation website.